Good morning, Mino-Bimadiziwin Anishinaabe. Good morning, Chief Neepanak. Good morning, everybody who's tuning in to check us out today. We got a very special presentation today. We have an interview with our chief, Derek Neepanak. He's going to be speaking today on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and how Chief Neepanak feels it affects us as a nation. So, Chief Neepanak, do you want to introduce yourself to everybody who may not know who you are?
Sure. I hope I'm coming through okay this morning, Justin. Thanks for agreeing and putting together this important conversation that we as Anishinaabe people need to have about recent developments in Canadian law and the implications thereof to our community, and I think Indigenous people on a broader level. Of course, the Mino-Bimadiziwin Anishinaabe is a community of about 4,600 people. We're the largest of the Treaty 4 bands in Canada now. Our population has grown considerably, as have, of course, many First Nations communities across the country lately. But myself as chief, I come from the Neepanak family, of course. We have a long history in Pine Creek. Neepanaks are originally Treaty 2 family from the Skownan area. So on the east side of Lake Winnipegosis is where we originated from. So we're originally a Treaty 2 people that migrated to Pine Creek, along with a lot of other families at the rise of the residential school era. Back at the turn of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century in the 1890s, early 1900s. I myself, I'm also tied to, Treaty 1 community. My dad's side is in the Sandy Bay community. So I relate to both Treaty 2 and 4 and Treaty 1. I was originally elected as chief of Pine Creek First Nation in 2008, and that was after doing a first-class honors bachelor's degree at the University of Alberta, and then, of course, a law degree at the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan. I was also working on my master's degree in Indigenous governance at the University of Winnipeg when I was elected in 2008. I did 2 terms as chief back home, and then I was elected to the role of the Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. And then from there, I took a break after 2017, took a few years off, did some private business, and came back as the chief of Pine Creek, or Mino-Bimadiziwin Anishinaabe, because we reclaim our language and our old names in 2021, June. So I guess yesterday would have been a 2-year anniversary of my re-election back home.
Well, we're glad to have you back, Chief.
It's a challenge. It's the role of leadership in the community is not an easy one. It's thankless oftentimes, and the reasons why you become a leader are many, but the biggest one has to be to contribute to Mino-Bimadiziwin, the pursuit of well-being, the pursuit of a good life for our community on a broader basis.
Which is kind of what brings us here today, I guess, hey?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Chief, for the benefit of the audience today, can you please explain a bit about what the UNDRIP means to our community? How does it impact the lives of Indigenous people here in our treaty territory?
Sure. I think as a community chief, first of all, I think this is a national issue. So would a community chief be involved with a national issue? A lot of people think that, the community chief is responsible for the roles and responsibilities granted to them under the Indian Act. So, I should be sitting in the office, doing a dog bylaw, or, putting together bylaws, for local application, under the Indian Act. And that's simply not what we are as Anishinaabe people. We'll never be prescribed what we're supposed to be, under the Indian Act, and prescribed how we're supposed to be under the Indian Act. We're an international people. We're part of an international community, and that's why national issues, that find their way into our community, which often start in broader national conversations, like in Ottawa, have pertinence and relevance in our community, because decisions that are made in law and regulation and policy in Ottawa, or even in the region that we call Manitoba, eventually trickle down and have an impact on how we live our lives in the community. And sometimes it's not overnight. Sometimes it takes years. For example, Jordan's Principle took years to develop as a policy before governments finally started funding Jordan's Principle. And now we have, a full program in the community that employs people and also responds to the needs of every single family that needs the services of Jordan's Principle. But that was decades in the making. And that was a lot of work from a lot of people regionally and nationally to push that agenda. So national issues do have an impact, and it's very important to be cognizant of the connecting factors that bring a national subject matter into the scope of what happens in our community on a day-to-day basis. And that's why it's important. And that's why I agreed to be, the Manitoba representative on the ad hoc committee on the United Nations Declaration, Bill C-15 Action Plan Framework, because it does have an impact every day. So,
oh, absolutely. So how has Canada treated the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples since, say, 2007? What is Bill C-15, and why should we, as Anishinaabe people under the treaty, pay attention to this bill?
Well, the United Nations Declaration is obviously it's an international instrument, and it was passed in 2007 internationally. But it wasn't until the Liberals came into power in 2016 that they formally adopted it as part of the law of Canada, and then put forward a Bill C-15, which called for the implementation of the United Nations Declaration in Canadian law, but also to put together a framework, and that framework would become an action plan for implementation. And interestingly enough, that process took a number of years to put together. It received royal assent very recently, and the action plan was actually declared, and it's now a public document. That action plan goes through a number of shared priorities with government. It's also distinctions based, which means that it's been broken down into First Nation priorities, Métis priorities, and Inuit priorities. So it is a comprehensive document. It's available online. There's a lot of legal language in that document, but it does lay out the framework. The framework is not the implementation of UNDRIP. The framework is how to implement UNDRIP in the Canadian legal context. So there's a number of different prioritized items in that framework that will allow for, in the years to come, a means of implementing some of the core features of the United Nations Declaration. And I'd also like to, make sure that we keep in mind that, this is not just a prescribed process by the Department of Justice or Canadian lawmakers. This process and the establishment of this framework involved Indigenous people across the country. From coast to coast to coast, communities through their organizations or directly through involvement through their community contributed to the priority items that found their way into this action plan. So this really is what I would say a collaborative document. Of course, it's never perfect, but nobody ever said that relations between Canada and Indigenous people would be perfect in 2023. We recognize collectively that we're overcoming a huge legacy of genocide. We're trying to overcome, a lot of fear, a lot of trauma that's been built into our collective consciousness as Indigenous people as a result of our early interactions with, Canada's Constitution and its implementation towards us. So this is a watershed moment, I believe, to work with a new set of tools that will take shape within the context of this broader conversation that's happening now. So it's very important, I think, that we look at its content. I know that there's certain groups that don't want to look at the implementation of UNDRIP because they say it's watered down or it's been domesticated or so forth. Like I respect everybody's perspective, and I respect a lot of the policy conversations that are out there. But I sat in those circles, I sat in the meetings, I made the trips to the meetings, I joined online. I invested the time to get a good understanding of what this is all about. And I'm not somebody who can be easily tricked into something. I've done my homework, on many levels to make sure that we understand what's going on here.
I bet a lot of the viewers, people watching now and people watching later, are probably interested in what specifically those perspectives are, those opposing perspectives are concerning the Bill C-15. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little?
I think like we have to respect that there's a diversity of interests and a diversity of perspectives within a colonized Canada. And we as Indigenous people have been, thoroughly, indoctrinated in Canadian colonial processes and institutions. And as we move away from colonization and we strip away, the effects of trauma and colonization, we begin to get a clearer picture of what actually I think is at play here. I think I'm going to say I got to respect everybody's perspective. I think that the First Nation priorities identified in the action plan will turn into opportunities for us to become stronger within our homelands, within the economic, social, and political spaces that we now operate within. And we as treaty people, we don't operate and live in a bubble. We live and we operate every day in a broader, social, rural and urban and Canadian and provincial context. The character of who we are as Indigenous people is changing. It's changing to become more incorporated within ultimately a global community that exists around us, and we have to be prepared, to address some of our fears. Some of the fears around the end of the Indian Act, fears around, what does it mean when action plans are put in place to implement UNDRIP. We need to, I think, walk bravely, and we have the capacity to do that now. We're not playing catch up anymore with Canadian law. Some of our best and brightest people who are, initially Mino-Bimadiziwin speakers are better English speakers and French speakers than Canadians are, because of their grasp of, Canadian law and the work and effort they've put in to understand Canada's constitution and what we need to do to protect ourselves each and every day when Canada uses its constitution to advance policy, regulatory or legal frameworks. So
if Bill C-15 did actually create an onus on Canada to create an action plan to implement the UNDRIP as it stands into Canadian law, what is the action plan? How will it inevitably apply to us?
I think what happens is that it's best to take a look at the action plan. It's on Canada's Department of Justice website. It's very easy to search up. If you have a little bit of understanding of the Department of Justice search engine, you can just type in UNDRIP implementation, and you'll get the action plan in there. The action plan breaks down into shared priorities, First Nation priorities, Inuit and Métis priorities, and it's a fairly wordy document. So you do have to understand, the language a little bit to drill down in terms of the broader concepts that will eventually form, distinct action plans. For example, the implementation would require Canadian laws to adhere to the principles and the core principles of UNDRIP. For example, one of those action pieces that we advanced was with respect to Section 207 of the Criminal Code. We got a legal opinion on Section 207 of the Criminal Code, which speaks to the issue of lotteries and gambling schemes in provinces. Now, provinces are allowed to create regulatory and legal schemes under Section 207, but we're not allowed to as Indigenous people. And we know that, creation of lotteries and gambling has created economic opportunity and economic foundations for, provincial governments to build budgets and spend. We have been denied that opportunity. So if we're going to be applying UNDRIP, we need to remove those barriers in Canadian law, such as Section 207, in order to advance our own regulatory regimes and our own legal regimes forward for economic opportunity. That's guaranteed to us in UNDRIP. So that's just one example. There's a number of very broad examples within the action plan that will get us to a point where people and communities are making government-based decisions to access their resources and to build economic, social, and political well-being through those mechanisms.
Absolutely. Just as
Yeah,
an aside, we're getting a few comments coming in through the social media channels, and I just wanted to let everybody know that we'll have a questions and answers period near the end of the broadcast, so we can continue here without interruption.
sure.
All that being said, then, Chief, how are our sacred treaties are at risk of being affected with this action plan?
I think that treaty perspective is very broad, and treaty is sacred. Treaty is grounded in ceremony. Oftentimes, we see politics twisting treaty towards political agendas that take us outside, perhaps, the sacredness of the ceremony of treaty. I think that I myself, when I was younger in leadership, I oftentimes ventured into political spaces with our treaty conversations, and I think that that's not the way to go when we talk about treaty. I've done a lot of things to uphold my understanding and to build and promote identity around a treaty-based learning. We as Anishinaabe people are largely under treaty, and we have inherent rights. We have sovereignty intact, and what we negotiated at treaty was a middle ground. We didn't acquire rights at treaty because as free people, what rights could new settlers give to us? We were already free here, so our rights were already fully entrenched under natural law and our relationship to the Creator. So treaty was really the basis upon which new relationships could be built. And when I think about it in that context, Canada and its colonial infrastructure are now starting to wake up to understandings of the possibility of what treaty could mean. I don't think our treaties are at risk in the action plan. I think that we have to be wary of each and every step that we take when it comes to working with, within a Canadian constitution or alongside a Canadian constitution. I still believe very much in the two-row wampum philosophy. It's an ideology that respects, the integrity of our inherent rights as self-determining, self-sustaining, and self-governing people. But at the same time, I also recognize that, there's millions and millions of people who have come from other parts of the world to live a Canadian experience here. And we have to find ways of harmonizing our pathway forward in order to be effective, for future generations to find that what I call Mino-Bimadiziwin, that good way forward.
Absolutely, Chief. I feel like there is a necessity to evolve as a
Hmm.
people and what we believe in order to achieve that what you say there, the Mino-Bimadiziwin. And this action plan to implement UNDRIP in Canada, it refers to the end of the Indian Act. What is the Indian Act, and why is it important?
I think that the Indian Act oftentimes is confused with treaty because we hear a lot of people say that oh, I filled out the application, I sent it into Ottawa, I got a status Indian number, and now I have my treaty rights back. Like it's almost as if Canada qualifies what treaty is, and that's I think a miscommunication or an error in understanding. I think that the moment you're born and the first breath you draw is when you become a treaty person. It doesn't have anything to do with the acquisition of a status Indian number under Canada's Indian Act. It has nothing to do with those non-insured health benefits, for example, that you get when you produce your status Indian card at the pharmacy. Our treaty is so much more comprehensive. Our treaty, like I said, entrenches and identifies, recognition of a mutual state of government. That mutuality recognizes our inherent right as self-determining people. It doesn't give us these rights. Like I said, these always pre-existed. The day before treaty, we were free, we were self-determining, we were self-governing, we were self-sustaining. And we as people, I think, wake up to that recognition and remember that at all times in our dealings with Canada. And that's why I say that two-row wampum ideology and philosophy is so important as we venture forward. Um, how does that tie into the Indian Act? Well, like I said, a lot of people think that that status Indian card is our treaty. But like I said, Canada does not qualify who is treaty and who isn't. There's a lot of people out there who are actual treaty descendants and they have ancestral ties to treaty, but yet they're not status Indians. Some of them are Métis, for example. Some of them don't even identify as Métis because of, the dynamics of family. It's very interesting that, there's treaty people walking around out there who have ancestral ties to one of our treaties that don't even know that history because of the colonial legacy that it created. The 60s and 70s scoop and the disconnection and the breakdown of kinship lines. Treaty is very, very, very comprehensive, and it's entrenched, in our DNA. So the sooner we move away from this idea that the Indian Act is what gives treaty, the stronger we're going to be. We talk about housing as a treaty right, for example, and I saw that come up. Housing is, if you ask the warriors who were at the treaty negotiations, if Canada came in or the treaty commissioner came in and said, I'll give you guys a house, and he says that to the warriors that are at the camp, do you think the warriors would accept a Canadian from somewhere out east coming in and saying that they're going to give them a house or shelter? I don't think so. I think that our people have always provided for ourselves. We built our own homes, and we always had the tools and the mechanisms in place to be able to take care of our households. No promise from Canada could ever replace that. So we live in this day and age now where we have social programs such as CMHC housing or band subsidy housing, and people are saying that that's their treaty right. Well, it's not. The treaty right is much more comprehensive. We have a right to sustain ourselves in our own homes. That means having the resources and the resources to harvest our wood, to mill our wood, and to build our homes the way we want them to. That, to me, would be the implementation of the treaty right to housing. If you have a person who leaves the community and goes and harvests their wood in the Duck Mountain and brings that wood home and builds their home with the local resources and lives in that home, that's the treaty right to housing. But that is somewhat lost in some of the conversation because we haven't been doing that. But we need to get back to that. We need to start exercising our rights within the framework of treaty. And I think that we can do that if we move past the confusion that the Indian Act has created. It's the Indian Act under Section 6 that creates an Indian today. Like, we don't decide. We don't have any decision making as communities in who's going to become a status Indian. We can decide if we control our band list who becomes a member of our band. But Canada has always decided who becomes an Indian under the Section 6 application. And that is a means of controlling identity. But at the same time, it's a means of controlling costs out the door. So I think we need to change that. And I think the action plan, once it focuses in, zeroes in on that, and it does speak specifically to membership and citizenship. I think that's a very important piece of the action plan, is that we take back ownership of who our people is, as opposed to Canada deciding from a cubicle somewhere in Gatineau who's an Indian and who isn't, because that's what's happening today, and that's been happening for a very long time.
Yeah, I'm trying to work my way through the report myself. There is a lot of interesting information there, and I'm going to have to share a link to the report as a part of the stream after the fact for those of you who want to take a look at it. Moving on, though. Some people are saying that our rights are being terminated under the federal government's policy and legislative process. Are our rights being terminated if the Indian Act is abolished by Canada?
Well, as I kind of set the stage for this question a little bit earlier when I mentioned that a lot of us have been lulled into thinking that the Indian Act is where our treaty is. Even for example, when you go hunting, if you can produce your status Indian card, then the conservation officer will leave you alone, provided you're not in a closed area, for example. So there's a lot of us, not only us, but also Canadians, who are lulled into this idea that the status Indian is the treaty Indian, but they're separate and apart, because there's a lot of people who are, like I said, treaty, but they're not even status, so they don't apply for the status Indian card. There's a big difference there. So our rights are not being terminated. I know that that's very popular right now. I consider that to be what I call fear-based, political rhetoric. I don't believe in that notion. It ties back into earlier days of some of the recent policy, we'll say, back into the 60s when the white paper came out, and there was a policy paper that called for the end of the Indian Act. And assimilation of Indigenous people into Canadian society. And you know, that was a dark period. But what happened was our leadership at the time, they convened and they started to organize. Our response in Manitoba from the Manitoba chiefs of the day was the creation of Wabung. And that document is online. It's available for everybody to see, but it really provided for a collective political voice to begin moving into a more structured political environment. And that led to, I believe, you know, the inclusion of Section 35 in Canada's Constitution, which, you know, recognizes existing Aboriginal, you know, and treaty rights. This Section 35 is a new limb on the tree of Canada's Constitution, and that limb is very strong because strong people have stepped up and reinforced it by creating legal precedent in Canadian law. We can't be terminated because we're part of, you know, that whole discussion, and it's become entrenched over the years, like I said, with very important legal precedent that's forming, you know, the identity of what that Canadian Constitution is. And, you know, there's always the argument, too, that we're not part of Canada's Constitution. And I respect that perspective as well. It's a fundamental perspective and a fundamental belief that's entrenched in our sovereignty and our self-determination. And I've seen many people that articulate that. I myself, I would say I'm a frustrated Canadian at best. Like I have the, you know, the Canadian passport. Otherwise, I can't travel. I have a Canadian driver's license that says Manitoba on it, you know, so that I can drive on the roads in my own territory. So there are compromises we have to make as Indigenous people just to be able to function, just to be able to move around, you know. But at our heart, you know, my late elder reminds me, you know, he always introduced himself as Anishinaabe first, as a treaty Indian, and then somewhere down the line, you know, somewhere down the line he's a Manitoban maybe, somewhere further down the line he's a Canadian maybe, you know. So I think a lot of us are still in that space. We've never done the oath of citizenship under Canada's Citizenship Act. Whereas most people, I think all people that travel to Canada now to become citizens are part of that ceremony where you do have, where you do have to do the oath of citizenship. I was at one of those ceremonies one time and I just sat down. I didn't do the oath. Even though everybody in the room was doing the oath, I was one of two people that sat down and didn't do it, because I want to respect, you know, the foundation of our identity as Anishinaabe people is not Canadian. The foundation of our identity is long back in history, you know, and we even have articles of clothing in museums that are older than Canada. You know, people's shoes are older than Canada as Anishinaabe people, and I think that's important for us to remember. And no action on paper, and I've said this a lot of times, no action on paper by a Canadian colonial government can strip us away of our inheritance and the covenant of treaty. The treaty is always going to be there. We just have to make sure that we're stepping carefully through these conversations to keep it intact and to make sure our young people have a chance to be proud of their treaty identity.
Absolutely. Well, other people are saying that we're becoming akin to a fourth level municipality if we get out of the Indian Act. I personally have heard this myself. Do you feel that's correct and a correct description of what's happening, or is this something that people are agreeing to?
I think that there's a lot of different policy angles to look at these difficult questions. And you know, I do believe that when we go back to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People back in the 90s, there was talk of a fourth level of government that would be distinct and join, the collectivity of governments within the Canadian Constitution. I think that's where that fourth level idea kind of started to really take some shape. And I don't look at hierarchies. It's not the Anishinaabe way to live in hierarchy. No Anishinaabe thinks they're better than the other one in the cultural context and in the ceremony. Everybody has their work to do. So I don't believe in hierarchy that way. So I don't believe we're at any level, you know, when it comes to, you know, a federal or provincial or a municipal level. Municipalities are actually created under Section 92 of Canada's Constitution, and it falls under the head of a provincial power. So municipality legislation is created by provinces. I don't see any instance, from the work that I've seen under self-government agreements where, the term municipality is even used. within self-government agreements. Like if you ask the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation down the road, not too far from here, whether they're a municipality, that would be fighting words because they're a self-governing community. They have made negotiations and settlements with Canada. They have a self-government agreement that takes the shape of Canadian law. They are far from a municipality. They're a self-governing people that are building the laws, that they will use as a community for the pursuit of well-being for their families in the community. So I find the term municipality a bit provocative. It suggests assimilation into, legislative structures under provincial law, and I think that that's misleading. So I reject that notion outright. And I know, I have great respect for Russ Diabo. I've seen a lot of his work. He's very, very thorough. But some of his conclusions, such as saying we're moving into municipality status, to me is just misleading for people, and I don't agree with that at all. But like I said, he's got expert level teachings and very, very thorough. But in terms of conclusion on where we're going, I myself as an Anishinaabe, with responsibilities for leadership, with responsibilities to respect treaty, would never agree to, under our treaty table to a municipal agreement. Like that to me is ridiculous to suggest. And I just reject that outright. I don't see it as effective, and I don't see it as contributory to a very important conversation that needs to be had.
Excellent. So, with that being said, Chief, is there anything like the questions? I hope we've answered all the questions that people might have regarding the UNDRIP document. Is there anything else that you'd like to add apart from the questions that I've asked you here today?
I think that it's nice that people are asking questions. And I see, like, for example, Michelle Robinson saying her child needs Indian Act status. I think that there's a very practical reason for people to be applying for status, and that is oftentimes economic. We have not implemented a treaty card, for example, that provides for the same level of access to services that Canada has provided under its non-insured health benefits program, under its access to post-secondary funding through its various institutions, such as on reserve post-secondary student agreements. We have not stepped up to provide that as treaty communities. We've contemplated it, but Canada is still, the practical provider of solutions as for status Indians. So I don't discredit or disregard anybody who takes that step. I myself, I have a status Indian card. I threw my status Indian card away in 2013. But recognizing that there's a very practical reason, and it's oftentimes economic. People need those medications covered. People need that access to education. People need, to feel part of a community and access services in the community, such as social supports and so forth. That to me, deserves a lot of respect, and we need to work with the tools that we have today in order to advance the conversation forward. So I think it's important. And, I like that somebody says we're not Canadian, because within that conversation itself, if you asked Indigenous people across the country, are you Canadian? You're going to get a lot of them who say yes. You're going to get a lot of people whose grandparents fought for Canada, in the great wars of the past. You're going to get families who currently have people enrolled to fight for Canada, in Canada's military, for example. But at the other end, you're going to get people who, look at Canada as occupying their ancestral homelands, and they reject the idea of Canada outright. And there's room for all those conversations. I myself, I said I'm the reluctant Canadian. I carry a passport, so that I can cross the medicine line. These are complex conversations, and everybody deserves respect to express themselves the way they want to.
Well, I can see that well, when you mentioned the Canadian passport, the Canadian driver's license under the provincial at the provincial level in order to drive and to travel, I can see a need for that. However, do you foresee maybe not even within our lifetime, but in recent or near future, sorry, if we were to leave the Indian Act, do you see the bands themselves assuming control of who becomes a status Indian and what rights they have available to them?
keep in mind that under the Indian Act, chief and council are defined. So that is a conversation we need to have, I think, internally as Indigenous people, is that, when we become elected in as chiefs or councillors, some say they're treaty chiefs, some say they're Indian Act chiefs, some say they're a little bit of both. We have to sit down and have that conversation about what is a treaty chief. Can you say you're a treaty chief if you've been elected in under the regulations of the Indian Act election regulations, for example? Because you're being elected in under Canadian law, and that is not necessarily treaty. So the power center is really what the question is, and I think that we've looked at various models of governance. I've sat at the Treaty 2 table, and there's a model of governance there where the people decide, who their governing council is going to be, who their grand chief is going to be, for example. At Treaty 2, we've contemplated, and I've expressed this outright. I said I think the people should vote for the grand chief. It shouldn't be the chiefs voting for the grand chief, but the people. Because there's a very small number of chiefs who are voting for these grand chiefs titles, and in some cases, grand chiefs are being acclaimed, under provincial corporate laws, and that to me is where the confusion is when it comes to true power and authority and governance in our systems. There's clan-based conversations we need to have that are very strong within our ceremonies now, but they're not strong in expressions of social and political will outside of the ceremony, because not everybody does ceremony. We have a lot of people who become Christianized and pray and exercise spirituality in different ways. So there's a lot of complexity to this, but we look at Canada's recent legislation, let's call it C-92, an act respecting children and families. They talk about Indigenous governing bodies in there, which gives us some room to express ourselves in different ways. It gives us some room to delegate and recognize at a local level who's responsible for the well-being of our children. Everybody puts it on the backs of chief and council, but maybe the grandmothers are the ones that are willing to dedicate the time to set the record straight. And some communities are moving in that way, and I know we are at Mino-Bimadiziwin. We're doing our best to try to set some of the records straight within the structure and the framework we have. So Canada would want us to move into a self-government agreement. I think at some point, whether we do that or not, is up to us to decide. They're not pushing us. We're not going to fall into any traps that way. We're going to be very careful. We're going to be, very, very, very careful with how we proceed if we ever want to move in that direction. And I'm taking nothing away from those who have gone that way. But we are treaty people, and maybe there's room for a treaty framework to take shape within the action plan. Maybe there's some room there. I'm not going to throw it out. 100%. I'm not going to throw it out, the window, the action plan, because there's possibility there. And if we don't work within the space of possibility, then what are we doing? We're not. I don't think that we're really, pushing the agenda for our people if we're not looking at the possibilities that we bring as a human family. So,
well, I see part of the issue being sometimes our inability to have polite disagreement, and I really feel that we need to come to the table and just talk about it. And this particular report might be just the baseline of somewhere to start to begin the conversation between the nations and come up with something that's kind of overarching over all First Nations people. But yeah, I really am liking what I'm seeing so far. I'm liking what you're saying, Chief. Do you have any other comments that you'd like to make?
I think that like I said at the outset, we have to be careful with the steps we take within the action plan. We've seen governments in place that are amenable to full respect of Indigenous rights. We see that, for example, in the legislation, like I said, that's been recently passed. The Liberals have recognized the inherent right of Indigenous people to take care of the well-being of their children. That is the first step in legislation, because most of Canada for the last 150 years, and many lawyers know that, believe that they covered the field when it comes to law, which meant that they left out Indigenous law completely. And the law books in the provinces and the federal government are still largely crafted that way. They're making some space within common law through legal precedent, for Indigenous law to emerge. But for the most part, the books of Canadian law are still absent recognition of Indigenous law. So we have to be careful, because governments can use that. They can use that to their advantage. They can use that strategically in the development of policy, regulations, and law going forward. So we have to do our homework each and every step. We can't let them off the hook as we move forward. The action plans have to be legitimate, because if they're not, we'll see it immediately. We're not naive to what they're doing now. Like I said at the outset, we have very, very educated people out there that are on our side. They're on our team, working every day, getting that law degree done. Sitting in the law school library, understanding, what genocide means, understanding the exclusion of our laws within their, legal framework, and coming out and fighting. And that's what's different from the previous attempts in 1969 white paper to now, is that we have the ability to go toe to toe with anybody when it comes to implementing our ways. And I firmly believe in that. So,
Indeed, sir.
Yeah, just one final note on the AFN. There was a question that, with respect to the AFN, the Assembly of First Nations is going through a lot. There's changes that are happening. I looked, when I became a chief initially, as the AFN as kind of our high water mark when it comes to national political initiative. I did look at it in a bit of a hierarchical sense, and that we needed to move, sovereignty through structures like the AFN and so forth. And that was, a little bit naive. I think that when I look at it now, the AFN is a very definitive structure within Canadian bureaucracy. It is an incorporated body. So it's subject to the laws of Canada, subject to the Canada Labor Code, all those things that apply to institutions in Ottawa apply to the AFN. It's not distinct. It's not sovereign. It doesn't express a sovereign identity. It's there for a purpose, and that purpose is for collective advocacy, bringing people together like us as chiefs to influence policy, to advocate for change. It also oftentimes is used as a clearinghouse for consultation. So there's money that goes into the organization that's then distributed for the purpose of engaging conversation. And I think that's an important feature of it. It's not going to bring sovereignty that way. Like, that's not what the AFN is all about. It never has been. And I think bringing people together for conversation is important, because, I've been to places in the world where you're not allowed to talk about government in a negative way. Otherwise, you'll go to jail or worse. So we have an opportunity through that mechanism for important discussions that need to be had. Is it a rights holder? No, unless you're talking about the rights it has as a corporate entity, then it does have rights as a corporate entity. But in terms of rights as, inherent rights of Indigenous people, it doesn't have that. It's a structure. And I think that we have to recognize the practical limitations that exist within that incorporated structure, and recognize that there's still a lot of work to do. That to me is important. And, this isn't a campaign speech by any means. Like, I'm not interested in that infrastructure. I'm doing the work for our community, and that's what it's always been about. I think it's important to stay grounded in our roles and responsibilities, but recognize what's out there. And I will go to the AFN, next week to move some important conversations forward, or to at least be part of those conversations, because I think it's important for us to participate with the venues that we have for important discussion. So that's all I have. That's all I have, Justin. I thank you for, coordinating our conversation today. I hope that people picked up a little bit from this. Like I say, there's a lot of positions that are being brought forward. There's a lot of support nationally for the action plan from different communities and different leadership, but there's also a lot of dissident criticism that wants to reject the action plan outright, and that's okay too.
Because you need opposition.
Absolutely, you need room for everybody in this conversation, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts as someone who actually sat in in the ad hoc committee and watch this conversation unroll and make its way through.
Well, I'm sure we all appreciate your thoughts as well. As far as the live streaming goes, just so you know, everybody, we do have our own YouTube channel. We're very active on Facebook and Instagram. So please do, if you want to keep on top of everything that's Pine Creek, we're trying to expand our reach all the time. Like and subscribe to the videos. Keep in touch with us. Send messages via the website. We do have an email address, info@pcfn.ca. I should have posted that. I wasn't prepared. I apologize. But we will get that going. In the meantime, thank you, Chief. I'm very happy with what's going on in the community personally. I'm very excited to see everything that's coming up in the future. And hopefully we can have more of these discussions, maybe on a more regular basis.
Miigwech, I appreciate the time today, and everybody enjoy your weekend.
Everybody, see you later.